Good afternoon. This is Dr. Bryson with another video for the criminal profiling class. This class is for the summer of 2022. In this video, we're going to talk a little bit about the ethics of using criminal profiling. Now, I want to point out that criminal profiling is used in two different places in the progression of the criminal justice system. It is used in the investigation process. So if you remember cops, courts, corrections, it's used in the cops section of the progression of the criminal justice system, and then it's also used in the courts section of the criminal justice system. In the cops section, it's used in the investigation of usually violent crimes such as child abductions, more likely serial child abductions, serial rapists, serial killers, maybe bank robbers, but some of the more serious felons. Now, when it's used in the investigation phase, the idea is that it helps the investigators gain a grasp of the psychological working of the individual, hopefully to reduce the pool of suspects based on the psychological profile, but it is better used to predict where what kind of crime the next crime might be, the kind of places where this person might commit their crime. Maybe to be able to be there to stop the next crime before it occurs. When it's used in courts, this is where it really starts to get murky ethically. But we've talked about case linkages during this term. So imagine that you have two murders. Now we have evidence linking the suspect to this murder. Now the second murder over here looks very different. This second murder, looks exactly the same. The MO is the same. The profile of the killer is the same, but there's no evidence over here to link this person to this second murder, even though the two murders look almost identical. So we've got a conviction on this murder, and now the prosecutor is going for a conviction on this murder. And the only evidence that they really have is a profiler to come in and say, based on case linkage, my experience in linking cases, the murderer in this murder over here has to be the same one as this one over here. And since we know for certain it's this guy here on this one, then he's also the same one over here. Now, see, there is an ethical issue with that, because that still does not remove reasonable doubt. There is reasonable doubt because it could be that there are two people who simply because of circumstances and perhaps the circumstance of the crime itself committed the murder identically. Further, there might not be any quirkinesses in the murder scenes of either one. In other words, if just because they're identical, if everything is very common, that doesn't necessarily mean that it's the same killer. In other words, there are so many different things that can get muddled in that situation. And so I want to point that out. So when we talk about ethics, we're really getting at, is this the kind of evidence that the Constitution considers to be valid evidence? Is this case linkage and this criminal profiling evidence that pretty much is hearsay based on gut and a few interviews, a handful of interviews, and when I say a handful, I mean less than 50 really, interviews with known criminals, is that really good enough to say that this person has gotten due process, that this is beyond hearsay or speculative, one of those two types of evidence? So let's get moving, okay? So the first thing that we need to understand is that sometimes criminal profiling is based on gut feeling and confirmation bias. A profiler or even an investigator who fancies themselves as a profiler, so they do their own for their own investigation, they get this gut feeling about what is true and what isn't, and then they only seek out evidence to prove their hypothesis. So they get this gut feeling. But we say, but they're professionals, they've got all this experience, so their gut feeling has to be pretty good, right? Well, maybe, maybe not, but gut feeling is not good enough when we are talking about the constitutional rights of individuals. Okay, but this also can lead to overconfidence in one's own instincts. I've worked with a lot of police officers in various situations over the years, and most are very, very good. They're very objective, but man, I've had a few that they were just so overly confident in their own instincts. They had an instinct that this was right, therefore it was right. Now that gets right back to their gut feeling and their confirmation bias, that they're overconfident in it. And this is their instinct, and their instinct kicks in. Well, you know, I was born and raised in West Virginia, and I have fairly good instincts in the woods. You take me out into the woods anywhere, I mean, far away from any little town or whatever, and I'm pretty good at finding my way back. That's very instinctual. However, don't do that to someone on purpose. I would not intentionally go out into the woods without a compass and without knowing my way back. I would not do that, no matter how good my instincts are. I'm not so overly confident in my instincts that I think that I'm always going to be able to find my way back. I might not. So we've got to temper our instincts with logic and objective evidence. Next, science when the verdict is still out. Now, I don't mean the verdict is still out on the crime. I mean that with a lot of the, quote, science, which I believe it's pseudoscience, that has been applied in writing of criminal profiles, the science really doesn't have the hard and fast conclusions that the practitioners, in my mind, appear to say that it does. And when we cannot make such firm conclusions, we get ourselves in trouble. I was speaking with a physicist, someone with a PhD in physics, a couple of years ago. And this person was telling me that he keeps hearing all these social scientists in psychology, social work, sociology, get angry because their science is called soft science. But then he said, you know, when I do an experiment, a physics experiment, I can directly observe. I can see it. I know it's happening. Yet when I present my conclusions in my research reports that submitted to journals, I always present my conclusions in a tentative manner. And then he said, but, you know, I've read all of these social science research articles, and they always want to present their conclusions as though they are hard and fast rules. In other words, the soft sciences, where we cannot directly observe, we are implying conclusions based on the statistical analysis. We tend to have much more confidence in our conclusions. Well, see, the science behind the criminal profiling, the way it's done right now, the psychological science for applying it in profiling, is nowhere near the confidence level that we need for it to be, even as a soft science. So that's another ethical issue. When we become so hard and fast, and then we get into court and say, hey, the murderer in this case has to be the same one over here, because I know from experience and research that, okay, there are case linkages here. No, if there's not evidence, physical evidence linking this perpetrator to this murder over here, it doesn't matter that the psychological profile links the two together. That doesn't matter. A psychological profile appearing to link two cases together is not sufficient evidence constitutionally, logically, to convict a person of a crime. Now, might a jury hear that and still convict the person? Yes. But we have problems with our juries in this country. Jury studies have shown that jurors are seldom objective, and they believe bad evidence. Okay. Variability of personality, and this is what I kind of just got at. When we are creating a psychological profile, we forget that there's a variability in personality. So that, well, let me put it this way. Equifinality and equipotentiality. Equifinality is I can start from two different places and end up in an equal place. In other words, person A may start at point A, person B may start at point B, but they both might end up at point C. In other words, they got to point C from different places. Equal finish or equal final point equifinality from different starting places. There is also equipotentiality. Equipotentiality is I start at the same point, so person A and person B are starting at point A. That person A ends up at point B, person B ends up at point C. In other words, we both start at the same place, but we end up in different places. Equal potential, different ends. We have to understand that when we are interpreting behavioral evidence based on a personality profile. We have to understand that. Unexamined experience. And I'm going to say unexamined experience because even though the individual may believe that they have examined their experience, they're not willing to truly critically analyze it. And they're only going to analyze in such a way that supports what they want it to support. Oh, confirmation bias again. Gee, we keep getting back to that, don't we? Okay. It is very important to gain experience. The more experience a person has, the better they are at doing their job, right? We know that. The more experience they have, the better they are at doing their job. Okay. I'm not going to argue with that. But what I've learned from this experience may not be equal in the next case that I do. So saying, well, I saw this in this case, so it must be true in this case. That is an unexamined experience. It is an unexamined experience, and it is not conducive to good investigation. Okay, I'm going to stop the screen share as we have completed with the PowerPoint slides. Okay, but I'm hoping that you're beginning to see that logic must always prevail. There are some individuals that believe experience, gut feeling, and instinct should trump logic. They should not. Logic should trump them all. Logic should trump them all. I want you to hear that. Logic should trump them all. We'll see you next video.